The rain had turned the gardens of Vauxhall into a maze of black mirrors, every gravel path reflecting the erratic flicker of colored lanterns strung between the trees. Music from the orchestra drifted faintly through the damp air, waltzes and quadrilles that sounded mocking now, too bright for what was happening in the shadows. Elara Beaumont slipped through a side door of the pavilion, her silk mask still tied at the back of her head, though the domino cloak had been torn away somewhere inside. She needed air, needed escape from the whispers that had followed her all evening. The daughter of a traitor, they called her behind their fans. The girl who should never have been invited. She had come only because the invitation had borne the Duke of Blackwood's crest, and Silas Thorne's rare commands were not refused. She had not walked 10 paces along the secluded rose arbor when the footsteps began behind her, 3 sets, deliberate, unhurried. The lanterns here were fewer, the roses overgrown and wild, perfect for privacy. "Miss Beaumont," Lord Harrington drawled, his voice thick with wine and contempt. He stepped into the faint light first, flanked by Viscount Carver and Mr. Felix Langley, all 3 still wearing their masks, but pushed up onto their foreheads like boys playing at menace. "You wander far from the safety of the ballroom." Elara's pulse hammered in her throat. She took 1 step back, the heel of her slippers sinking into wet earth. "I was returning to my carriage." Carver laughed softly. "No need to hurry. We merely wish a private word." They closed the distance with the easy confidence of men who had never been told no. Harrington reached her first, catching her wrist before she could turn. His grip was iron. "Your father owed us a great deal before he fled the country," he murmured, close enough that she smelled brandy on his breath. "Debts pass to the daughter, do they not? We've been patient." "I have nothing to give you," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. Langley circled behind her. "Oh, but you do. Silence, for one. There are matters best left buried with your traitor's sire." Harrington's free hand rose, fingers brushing the edge of her jaw with false gentleness before the blow came, a sharp, backhanded slap that snapped her head to the side. Pain exploded across her cheekbone. She tasted blood where her tooth cut the inside of her lip. She staggered, but Carver caught her other arm, pinning her between them. Another blow followed, this one to her ribs, driving the air from her lungs. She doubled over, gasping, as Langley's fist twisted in her hair, yanking her upright. "Stay away from Blackwood," Harrington hissed. "He thinks to shield you. Tell him the protection ends tonight." The world tilted. Roses scratched her arms as they shoved her against the trellis. She clawed at Harrington's wrist, but the 3 of them were too strong, too certain. A knee drove into her thigh. She crumpled, silk skirts tearing on thorns. One of them, she could no longer tell who, kicked her once, hard in the side. Then came the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, distant but approaching. A lantern swung somewhere beyond the arbor. The men froze. "Enough," Harrington muttered. "The message is delivered." They released her abruptly. She fell to her knees in the mud, arms wrapped around her aching ribs, breath coming in shallow sobs. Footsteps retreated quickly, swallowed by the rustle of leaves and the renewed patter of rain. Elara stayed there, trembling, counting heartbeats until she was certain they were gone. Only then did she push herself up, one hand pressed to her bruised face, the other clutching a torn fold of her gown. She limped along the path toward the gate where carriages waited, praying the Duke's coachman had not yet left. The rain intensified, cold needles against her skin. She emerged from the arbor into the wider lantern-lit avenue, just as a black lacquered town coach drew to a halt. The door bore a discreet crest, a raven clutching a broken crown. Blackwood. The door opened before the steps were fully lowered. Silas Thorne stepped down into the rain without hat or cloak, his tall frame cutting through the downpour like a blade. Moonlight and lantern glow caught the hard planes of his face. High cheekbones, a mouth set in perpetual disapproval, eyes the pale gray of winter steel. He saw her at once. For a moment he was utterly still, rain darkening the shoulders of his evening coat. Then he moved, crossing the distance in 3 long strides. His gloved hand lifted her chin with surprising gentleness, tilting her face toward the light. The bruise was already blooming, dark and ugly against her pale skin. A thin line of blood traced from the corner of her mouth. His thumb brushed it away, the leather cool against the heat of the injury. Elara tried to speak, to offer some explanation, but the words tangled behind the swelling. Silas's gaze traveled over her, torn gown, muddied hem, the way she favored her left side. Something ancient and lethal stirred behind his eyes. The air around them seemed to chill further, though the rain was warm for the season. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost tender, and therefore all the more terrifying. "Who did this to you?" My lovely family, before we continue with this story, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell me in the comments section where you are watching from. The Duke's voice was soft. Who did this to you? The question hung between them like a blade unsheathed. Beyond the garden walls, London carried on dancing, laughing, drinking. Inside the circle of lantern light, a duke looked upon the woman he had quietly claimed as his own and felt, for the first time in years, the ice inside him crack. Elara's breath shuddered out. She could not yet answer. But in the silence, Silas heard everything he needed. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, the heavy wool swallowing her smaller frame. Then he lifted her into his arms as though she weighed nothing and carried her to the coach. The door closed behind them with a soft, final click. As the horses started forward, the Duke of Blackwood stared out at the rain-slicked night, memorizing every shadow. Somewhere in that darkness walked men who had dared lay hands on what was his. By morning, they would wish they had never been born. The carriage lurched forward into the night, wheels hissing over wet cobblestones as London's lanterns blurred into streaks of gold and crimson beyond the rain-lashed windows. Inside, the silence was absolute, but for the steady drum of hooves and the occasional creak of leather. Silas had settled Elara on the forward-facing seat, still wrapped in his coat, then taken the opposite bench himself. He had not released her hand. His gloved fingers encircled her wrist with deliberate care, as though measuring the frantic flutter of her pulse. The interior lamp was turned low, its flame shielded behind smoked glass, casting only enough light to reveal the damage. He studied her the way a general studies a battlefield map, slowly, thoroughly, committing every detail to memory. The bruise on her cheek had deepened to violet, the shape of knuckles clear beneath the swelling. A thin split marred her lower lip. A bead of blood had dried at the corner of her mouth. Her left eye was beginning to close. When she breathed, the smallest hitch betrayed the ache in her ribs. Mud streaked the pale column of her throat where rain had washed it down from her hair. Strands of that hair, once pinned in elegant coils, now clung damp and disheveled to her temples. Elara kept her gaze lowered, fixed on the join of their hands. She expected questions, demands, even anger directed at her for wandering alone. Instead, there was only that relentless scrutiny. At last, Silas moved. He drew a square of linen from his waistcoat and pressed it gently to the corner of her mouth, blotting away the crusted blood. The gesture was precise, almost clinical. Yet the tremor in her own fingers betrayed how deeply the tenderness unsettled her. "Tell me their names," he said at last. His voice was quiet, cultured, every syllable polished by years of command. But something raw threaded beneath it, something that made the air inside the carriage feel suddenly too small. She swallowed, tasting copper. I do not wish to make this worse, Your Grace. They only meant to frighten. They struck you. He said it as though stating an irrefutable fact of nature, like gravity or winter. They drew blood. That is not fright. That is war. Elara lifted her eyes then. In the dimness, his own gaze burned pale and arctic, fixed on her with an intensity that stole what little breath she had left. She had seen Silas Thorne at balls and assemblies, remote, immaculate, a man whose rare smiles never reached his eyes. Society called him cold, unfeeling. She had believed it. She did not believe it now. The change was subtle at first. A tightening along his jaw, the faintest flare of nostril, the way his thumb brushed once, almost unconsciously, across the inside of her wrist. Then it gathered, like storm clouds rolling in from the North Sea. His shoulders seemed to broaden, filling the confines of the carriage. The hand that held the handkerchief curled slowly into a fist. "Who did this to you?" he asked again, softer than before, yet the words carried the weight of an oath sworn in a crypt. Elara's throat closed. She had spent years shrinking from confrontation, accepting every slight as penance for her father's sins. Speaking names aloud felt like inviting greater ruin. Yet beneath the fear something else stirred, an exhausted, long-buried fury that Silas's steady grip seemed to coax to life. "Lord Harrington," she whispered, "Viscount Carver, and Mr. Langley." She watched the names strike him, one by one. His expression did not alter, but the temperature inside the carriage seemed to plummet. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register she had never heard from him, low, lethal, almost conversational. 3. A single word, yet it vibrated with promise. Silas released her wrist only long enough to reach up and rap sharply on the roof. The carriage slowed at once. The small hatch slid open. "Faster," he ordered the coachman. "Take the river road. No stops." "Yes, Your Grace." The hatch closed. The pace quickened until the wheels sang over the stones. He turned back to her. With careful fingers, he loosened the coat around her shoulders, inspecting the tears in her gown, the scratches along her collarbone where thorns had caught her. Each new mark seemed to etch itself onto his face, darkening the storm behind his eyes. "You will not return to your aunt's house tonight," he said. It was not a question. Elara managed a small shake of her head. "They know where I live." The admission hung between them, fragile and damning. Silas's jaw flexed. "They will know many things before dawn," he murmured, almost to himself. Then louder, "You are under my protection, Elara. You have been for longer than you realize. Tonight they forgot that. They will not forget again." Protection. The word should have comforted her. Instead, it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. She had glimpsed, for the first time, what that protection truly meant. What kind of man stood behind it? Silas leaned forward, elbows on knees, bringing his face closer to hers. The lamplight carved harsh shadows beneath his cheekbones. "Look at me." She did. The predator was fully awake now, barely leashed behind aristocratic restraint. Yet none of that ferocity was aimed at her. It was banked, coiled, waiting for other prey. "No one," he said deliberately, "will lay a hand on you again. Not while I breathe. Do you understand?" Elara found herself nodding before her mind caught up. Something in his certainty unraveled the knot of shame inside her chest, loosened it just enough to draw a deeper breath. Silas sat back, but the space between them no longer felt distant. He reached into the side pocket of the door and withdrew a small silver flask. Unscrewing the cap, he held it to her lips. Brandy. For the pain. She sipped obediently. The spirit burned a path to her stomach, spreading warmth against the chill. When she tried to pull away, he tipped it once more, ensuring she took enough, then drank a measure himself without flinching. Outside, London slipped past in sheets of rain, grand squares giving way to narrower streets, the river glinting black and restless beyond the embankments. Inside, the Duke of Blackwood began to plan. Elara watched the subtle movements of his face, the way his gaze turned inward, calculating distances, debts, vulnerabilities. She had always thought him made of ice. Now she understood the ice was only the surface, and beneath it ran something far more dangerous, molten, inexorable, ancient. The carriage thundered on toward Blackwood House. Behind them, the pleasure gardens of Vauxhall faded into the dark, their music swallowed by the storm. Ahead lay a night that would change everything. And in the hushed, lamplit space between them, a single question still echoed. No longer needing an answer. Who did this to you? Silas already knew. He simply wanted them to understand what came next. The carriage wheels had scarcely rolled to a halt before the great doors of Blackwood House when Silas stepped down, issuing a single low command to the footman who appeared. Elara was carried inside, past the marble hall and up the shadowed staircase by the Duke himself. He delivered her to the care of his most trusted housekeeper, Mrs. Whitlock, a woman whose discretion was as ironclad as her loyalty. And then he was gone. Silas did not return to his chambers. He did not pause for brandy or a change of clothes. The rain still clung to his coat as he descended the servants' stair and emerged into the mews behind the house. A fresh horse waited, already saddled, held by a groom who knew better than to speak. Silas swung into the saddle and vanished into the dripping streets before the clock in the stable yard struck 2. London never truly slept, but at this hour it wore a different face. Shuttered windows, flickering watch lamps, the occasional drunken reel of a late reveler. Silas rode through it like a specter, coat flapping black against the night. His first stop was a narrow house in Half Moon Street, its brass knockers shaped like a fox's head. He did not knock. The door opened before his boot touched the step, and a thin man in shirt sleeves bowed him inside. Mr. Josiah Pike, solicitor to half the indebted gentlemen of the ton, kept ledgers that no magistrate would ever see. He lit a single candle and laid 3 thick volumes on the table without being asked. Harrington, Carver, Langley, Silas said. Pike's fingers moved swiftly through the pages. Notes of hand, mortgages, vowels signed in haste after nights at faro or hazard. By the candle's guttering light, Silas read sums that could ruin earldoms. He memorized dates, witnesses, the names of banks holding the collateral. When he closed the last book, Pike produced ink and fresh paper. Silas wrote 3 letters in his angular, merciless hand. Short, precise, impossible to mistake. Each was sealed with black wax and the raven crest. "Deliver these at dawn," Silas instructed. "No earlier, no later." Pike inclined his head. Coin changed hands, more than enough to ensure silence. Silas rode on. Next came a tavern in Covent Garden, its signboard creaking in the wind. The Black Raven. Not his raven, but close enough. Down a flight of slick stone steps, he descended into a cellar thick with pipe smoke and the sour smell of ale. 6 men looked up from their cards and dice. Conversation died. They knew the Duke by sight, though few could claim to have spoken to him. One rose, a burly former sergeant from Silas's old regiment, now keeper of secrets for hire. "Need names and places," Silas said, sliding a folded paper across the table. The 3 names were written there. "Everything you have. Tonight." The sergeant read, whistled low. "That's dangerous game, even for you, sir." Silas's smile was a thin, cold thing. "Not for me." Within the hour, runners were dispatched into the fog. They would watch houses, listen at keyholes, note which servants could be bought and which mistresses talked too freely. By morning, Silas would know where each man slept, where they drank, where they hid their most shameful appetites. He moved again, this time to a quiet square in Mayfair, where a certain banker lived above his counting house. The man was roused from his bed in nightshirt and cap, eyes widening at the sight of the Duke on his doorstep. Silas did not raise his voice. He simply laid a single document on the desk, a promissory note signed by Viscount Carver, due at the end of the quarter. The banker paled. Carver's estate was already encumbered twice over. "Call it in," Silas said. "Tomorrow. No extensions. But your grace, the scandal, will be entirely Carver's." The banker swallowed and nodded. The night wore on, each visit a thread pulled in a vast web. A printer in Fleet Street received a purse and a list of facts to be set in type before sunrise. A magistrate in Bow Street accepted a quiet donation to his favorite charity and promised that certain warrants would be ready when needed. A bishop, deep in his cups at a discreet hell in St. James's, confessed over cards that Mr. Langley's youngest brother had debts that could strip the family of its last unentailed land. Silas listened, expression unchanging, and made note. Between each errand, he returned briefly to Blackwood House, ascending the back stairs to the corridor outside the guest wing. He did not enter Elara's room. Mrs. Whitlock had strict orders. But he paused at the door long enough to hear the soft rhythm of her breathing. Only then did he ride out again. By the time the rain thinned to mist and the first gray hint of dawn touched the rooftops, Silas had circled London twice over. He had spoken to 12 men in 6 different wards. He had signed nothing that could be traced, threatened no one with blade or pistol. He had needed none of it. His weapons were older, sharper. Debt, disgrace, the slow strangulation of reputation. His final stop was the river. He stood on the embankment near Westminster Bridge, watching the Thames slide past like black oil. The city was beginning to stir, milkmaids calling, chimneys exhaling pale smoke, the distant clang of a smith's hammer. Somewhere in those waking houses, 3 men slept, believing themselves safe behind titles and wealth. Silas removed his gloves, flexed fingers stiff from hours of riding. The cold air burned his lungs, but he welcomed it. It kept everything clear. He thought of Elara's bruised face in the carriage lantern, the way she had tried to shrink into the shadows even then. He thought of the tremor in her voice when she spoke their names. And for the first time in years, the ice inside him did not merely crack, it shattered. He mounted once more and turned the horse toward home. The streets were filling now with early carts and servants hurrying to market. A newsboy shouted the morning headlines, voice cracking in the chill. Silas passed him without slowing, but the words drifted after him like a promise. Extra! Extra! Scandal in the peerage! The sun was not yet up, but already the first ripples were spreading. By the time it cleared the rooftops, every club and drawing room in London would be buzzing. By noon, men would read their names in print beside words like insolvency, forgery, vice. By dusk, some would be packing for the continent. Silas rode through his gates as the stable clock struck 6. He handed the reins to a groom and walked into the house without looking back. His coat was soaked, his boots caked with mud. but his stride was steady, almost light. In the hall, he paused. Mrs. Whitlock waited at the foot of the stairs, hands folded. "She slept, Your Grace," the housekeeper said quietly. "The doctor has been. Bruised ribs, nothing broken. She asked for you." Silas nodded once. He climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the ache in his own shoulders, the burn of a night without rest. At the door to the guest chamber, he stopped again. Through the narrow gap he could see Elara propped against pillows, pale but awake, a faint bruise shadowing her cheek like a storm cloud. She met his gaze across the room. Something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, fear, perhaps the first fragile thread of trust. Silas did not enter, not yet. He inclined his head, the smallest acknowledgement, then turned toward his study. There was still work to do. Letters to dictate, accounts to settle, a war to finish. But the opening salvo had been fired in ink and whispers, and the enemy had not yet realized they were already bleeding. Outside, the sun broke free of the horizon, gilding the wet rooftops of London. And somewhere in that golden light, 3 men woke to a world that had shifted irrevocably while they slept. The Duke of Blackwood had only begun. The journey north began at dawn, under a sky the color of tarnished pewter. Silas had given orders quietly, efficiently. 2 coaches, 6 outriders, no crest displayed on the doors. Elara, bandaged and dressed in borrowed black, was handed into the first carriage as though she were made of glass. Silas rode alongside for the first mile, then swung up into the coach opposite her, pulling the door shut with a soft finality. They traveled fast, changing horses at private posting houses where the ostlers knew better than to ask questions. London fell away behind them, first the smoke, then the sprawl, then the last straggling villages. By late afternoon, the road climbed into wilder country. Rolling moors silvered with frost, stone walls threading the hills like old scars. The air grew sharp enough to bite the lungs. Elara slept fitfully, lulled by the rhythm of wheels and the lingering warmth of the heated bricks at her feet. When she woke, the light had thinned to a cold lavender, and the carriage was slowing. Ahead, Blackwood Manor rose from its valley like something carved rather than built. Dark stone, narrow windows, towers flanked by ancient yew. No flags flew. No lights showed yet in the lower windows. It looked, she thought, like a fortress waiting for siege. Silas handed her down himself. The wind whipped the cloak from her shoulders. He caught it and drew it close again, his gloved hands lingering a moment at her throat. Gravel crunched beneath their boots as they crossed the courtyard. Inside, the great hall was dim and vast, warmed only by a single fire roaring in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. Servants moved like shadows, taking cloaks, offering bowed greetings that Silas acknowledged with the smallest tilt of his head. He led her up a winding stair to a wing she had never seen on her few previous visits to the house. The corridor was lined with heavy oak doors and faded tapestries of battles long forgotten. At the end, a fire already burned in a small sitting room paneled in dark wood, its windows looking out over the black expanse of the moor. A connecting door stood open to a bedchamber beyond. "This is yours," he said simply. "No one enters without my leave." Elara stood in the center of the room, feeling small beneath the beamed ceiling. The ache in her ribs had dulled to a steady throb, but the bruises felt louder here, in the quiet. She turned to thank him, and found him watching her with that same unnerving stillness he had worn since the gardens. "You are safe," he said, as though reading the tremor in her hands. "They cannot reach you here." She believed him, and that belief frightened her almost as much as the attack had. Silas poured 2 glasses of wine from a decanter on the sideboard, deep red, almost black in the firelight, and handed her one. He did not drink. Instead, he moved to the window, staring out at the gathering dusk as if he could see every mile they had traveled. "Tell me," he said at last, voice low. "All of it." Elara lowered herself carefully into a chair by the fire. The warmth reached her chilled fingers, loosening something inside her chest. She had never spoken the full story aloud. It had lived in whispers and sidelong glances for years. "My father," she began, "was not always the man society remembers. Once he was charming, reckless, but charming. He believed fortune favored the bold. Cards, horses, investments in ventures no sane man would touch. By the time I was 15, the bold had become desperate." She sipped the wine. It tasted of black cherries and iron. Harrington's father held the largest notes. Carver's family had lent money against the unentailed lands. Langley's uncle financed the worst of the gambling. They were patient at first. Then the creditors' meetings began. Father promised repayment, sold what he could, borrowed more to cover the interest. When the crash came, some shipping venture in the Indies that sank with every penny aboard, he could not face them. Silas turned from the window. Firelight carved sharp shadows across his face. "He fled to the continent," Elara continued, voice steady now, "leaving my mother and me to the mercy of aunts and charity. Mother died within the year. The men never forgave the debt. They could not seize what was gone, so they seized reputation instead. Every invitation refused, every door closed. Whispers that we were no better than thieves. And then, letters. Reminders that debts pass down, that silence has a price." She looked into the fire. "I thought if I stayed quiet, kept apart, they would forget me. Last night proved they had not." Silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of logs. When Silas spoke, his voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. "They used you as leverage against me." Elara's head snapped up. "Against you?" His gaze met hers, unflinching. "Your father's last act before he fled was to sign over a packet of documents, letters, ledgers, that could ruin half a dozen powerful men if they surfaced. He entrusted them to me for safekeeping. I have kept them locked away these 7 years. Harrington and the others believe you know where they are, or that hurting you will force me to hand them over." The room seemed to tilt. All this time she had thought herself merely the shameful relic of a scandal, not a pawn in a larger game. "I knew nothing of any documents," she whispered. "I know." Silas crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her chair, an astonishing gesture from a man who bowed to no one. He took the wineglass from her numb fingers and set it aside. "But they do not. And they thought to break you, to break me." His hand rose, slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, his fingertips brushed the edge of the bruise along her cheekbone, feather light. "I should have brought you here years ago," he said quietly. "I told myself distance was protection, that my name alone would shield you. Arrogance." Elara's breath caught. The firelight gilded the harsh lines of his face, softened the winter in his eyes. She saw exhaustion there now, and something fiercer, regret perhaps, or the edge of a rage still banked. "You could not have known," she said. "I should have." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, careful, reverent. "I have spent years collecting debts, hoarding secrets, building walls. I thought them enough. They were not." For the first time since the garden, tears threatened. Not from pain or fear, but from the unbearable gentleness in his touch. She turned her face into his palm. "I am not worth a war, Silas." His grip tightened, not painfully, but with sudden intensity. "You are worth every war I will ever wage." The words hung between them, raw and irrevocable. Outside, the wind moaned across the moor, rattling the leaded windows. Inside, the fire settled into glowing embers. Silas rose, drawing her carefully to her feet. He led her to the connecting door and paused on the threshold of the bedchamber. A fire burned here too. The bed was turned down, warming pans already removed. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow we will speak of what comes next. Tonight, know only this. Blackwood has stood against armies. It will stand against 3 cowards." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, brief, chaste, yet it burned hotter than the fire behind them. Then he was gone, the door closing softly in his wake. Elara stood alone in the vast chamber, the echo of his promise settling around her like armor. For the first time in years, the weight of old shame felt lighter. Beyond the windows, night folded over the moor, black and absolute. Inside the fortress of Blackwood, a woman slept without fear, guarded by a man who had finally chosen to unleash the darkness he had kept leashed so long. The war had only begun. But here, in this remote and ancient place, Elara Beaumont began to believe she might survive it. The sun rose over London on a city that had already begun to devour itself. In the cramped printing houses of Fleet Street, the presses had not stopped all night. Ink-stained apprentices fed sheet after sheet into the hungry machines, the rhythmic thud echoing like distant artillery. By 5 o'clock, the broadsheets were bundled and loaded onto carts. By 6, they were in the hands of newsboys who shouted themselves hoarse along every thoroughfare from Mayfair to Whitechapel. The headlines were merciless. Earl of Harrington declared insolvent. Debts exceed £180,000. Shocking forgeries uncovered in peers' ledgers, family estates to be seized at Michaelmas, Lord Harrington woke to the sound of his butler's trembling knock. He had fallen asleep in his library some time after 4, an empty decanter at his elbow, convinced that the vague rumors drifting through his club the previous evening were nothing more than spiteful gossip. When he unfolded the first paper thrust into his hands, the words blurred before his eyes. He read them twice, 3 times, before the full horror sank in. Every vow he had ever signed, every desperate loan taken against future harvests that never came, every quiet arrangement with moneylenders who asked no questions, all of it was there in black and white. Dates, amounts, witnesses, even the forged endorsements on bills he had sworn were genuine. The printer had reproduced his own signature with chilling accuracy. By 7 o'clock, his creditors were already gathering in the hall downstairs, summoned by letters delivered at dawn. The knocker sounded without cease. His countess, pale and silent, watched from the landing as bailiffs began to catalog the silver. Harrington stumbled to the window. Across the square he could see neighbors peering from behind curtains, carriages slowing so their occupants might gape. A newsboy directly below waved a fresh bundle and shouted the headline again, as though the Earl might wish to purchase a copy for himself. In the coffee houses of St. James's, the scene was repeated in miniature. Men who had dined with Harrington only the night before now read the accounts aloud in hushed, incredulous voices. Some folded the papers with grim satisfaction, others paled, wondering which of their own secrets might next see daylight. Viscount Carver received the news at his breakfast table. A footman laid the broadsheet beside his plate with the same deference he might have shown the Morning Post. Carver's fork froze halfway to his mouth. The paragraph was shorter than Harrington's ruin, but no less fatal. His principal estate, the one that carried the viscountcy, had been quietly mortgaged to a northern banker who had abruptly called in the loan. Sale notices would appear within the week. Carver's hands shook so violently that coffee sloshed onto the linen cloth. He had always believed his debts manageable, renewable, endlessly deferrable among gentlemen. He had not imagined a world in which a banker would dare act without courtesy, without warning. Mr. Felix Langley read the accounts in his bachelor rooms in Albany, still in his dressing gown. His name appeared lower on the page, tucked among associated parties. But the implication was clear. His investments had been tied to Harrington's, his guarantees now worthless. A smaller notice announced that certain promissory notes bearing his signature had been presented for immediate payment. The sum mentioned was precise to the penny. Langley sat down hard on the edge of his bed. He had prided himself on walking the narrowest line between ruin and respectability. One push, and he had fallen. By 9 o'clock, Whites and Brookses and Boodles were thick with the smoke of urgent conversation. Men who had never acknowledged one another in the street now huddled together, comparing notes like conspirators. The question on every lip was the same, spoken at first in jest, then with growing unease. Who had done this? No one believed Harrington's collapse accidental. The details were too complete, the timing too perfect. Someone had gathered every thread of the Earl's financial disgrace and pulled them all at once. Someone with access to private ledgers, to sealed documents, to the quiet agreements that underpinned the entire edifice of aristocratic credit. And that someone had chosen to begin with Harrington, the loudest, the most arrogant, the one who had boasted only 2 nights ago that certain matters would soon be settled with Blackwood. The name of the Duke of Blackwood hung in the air unspoken, yet no one quite dared voice it. Not yet. Silas Thorne had always been a distant, glacial figure, wealthy beyond calculation, powerful in the lords, feared rather than liked. But this was not politics. This was annihilation. In the House of Lords, the benches filled early. Peers who rarely attended except for divisions now arrived in 2s and 3s, faces tight, eyes scanning the chamber as though an assassin might step from behind the throne. Whispers followed the Lord Chancellor as he took his place. Even the bishops seemed subdued. A minor baron, emboldened by panic, rose during a lull to ask whether the government intended to investigate certain malicious publications tending to the destabilization of public credit. The question died in murmurs. No one wished to be the next name in print. Across the river, in the narrower streets where clerks and merchants took their midday ale, the news was received with quieter satisfaction. Men who had been squeezed by aristocratic borrowers toasted the fall of an earl with cheap gin. A few wondered aloud whether the other 2 would follow, and if so, how soon. By evening, the ripples had reached even the highest drawing rooms. Invitations were hastily withdrawn. Hostesses struck names from guest lists with trembling pens. Mothers who had angled for Harrington's heir now steered their daughters elsewhere. The season, not yet fully begun, already carried the faint stench of fear. In the silence of Blackwood Manor, far to the north, Silas Thorne stood at the library window watching dusk settle over the moor. A single broadsheet lay open on the desk behind him, delivered by fast rider an hour earlier. He had read it once, expressionless, then folded it neatly and set it aside. Elara entered quietly, a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. The bruises on her face had darkened to deep plum, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in days. She crossed to stand beside him, following his gaze to the vast emptiness beyond the glass. "Is it done?" she asked softly. Silas did not answer at once. He reached for her hand, drawing it through his arm with the same careful possession he had shown since the night in the garden. "It has begun," he said. Outside Bunn, the wind rose, carrying the first distant rumble of a winter storm moving down from the hills. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm. In London, 3 men did not sleep. They waited for the next blow, listening to every creak of their houses, every knock at the door, wondering which of them would be broken by morning. The first ripple had struck the shore. The wave was still gathering. The letter arrived at Blackwood Manor on a morning thick with frost, delivered by a rider whose horse steamed in the courtyard. Silas broke the seal in the library, standing before the fire with his back to the door. The paper was heavy, expensive, the handwriting precise and familiar. A single page. No salutation, no signature, only a veiled threat wrapped in silk. "Return the documents by week's end, or the girl will suffer more than bruises next time." Silas read it twice. Then he folded it with deliberate care and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. He did not summon a servant. He went himself to the small morning room where Elara had taken to sitting, drawn by the southern light and the quiet. She was at the window, a book forgotten in her lap, gazing out over the frozen gardens. The bruises had shifted to sickly yellow at the edges, but the swelling had gone down. She looked fragile still, yet there was a new steadiness in the line of her shoulders. He closed the door softly behind him. "I need you to read something." Elara turned. The calm on her face wavered when she saw his expression. Cold, yes, but threaded with something darker. She rose and took the letter from his outstretched hand. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly. Color drained from her cheeks. "This handwriting." She stopped, throat working. "I know it." Silas waited. He had suspected, but he needed her to say it. "It's Lord Harrington?" she asked, uncertain. "No." His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Look again. The slant of the G, the loop on the Y. You have seen it on dance cards, on notes passed at assemblies." Elara's fingers tightened on the paper. Memory rose like bile. A younger self, 17 and flushed with her first season, treasuring small tokens from a man who had seemed kind, attentive in a way the others were not. He had listened when she spoke of books, had remembered her preference for lemon over orange in her punch. He had walked with her in moonlit gardens and spoken softly of futures. "Langley," she whispered. "Felix Langley." Silas inclined his head once. The letter trembled in her grip. He courted me, or I thought he did. After Father fled, when the invitations stopped and the whispers began, he still called. He brought books. Said he did not care about scandal. I thought he was a friend. Her voice cracked. When he asked to marry me, I was relieved, grateful. Then he told me the price. She did not need to finish. Silas could see it in the sudden rigidity of her spine, the recollection of words that had stripped gratitude bare and left only shame. He had offered marriage, yes, but only if she persuaded her absent father to repay certain debts. Or, failing that, if she used whatever influence she had with the Duke of Blackwood, whose ward she had quietly become, to secure leniency for Langley's family. When she refused, bewildered and hurt, the mask had slipped. The kindness curdled into contempt. He had called her ruined goods, a beggar in silk. After that, the campaign of quiet cruelty had begun. Rumors seeded at every ball, partners warned away, her name linked to fabricated indiscretions. Elara folded the letter along its original creases, as though to contain the poison inside. He led them, she said at last. Harrington struck first, because he is loud and cruel. But Langley planned it. He knew exactly where to find me at Vauxhall. He knew I would walk alone. Silas moved closer, but did not touch her. He believed you still weak, still the girl who would trade dignity for safety. I was that girl, she said bitterly. For years I was. No longer. The words were simple, absolute. Elara looked up at him. In the pale winter light, his face was all angles and shadows, the eyes winter gray and unreadable. Yet the space between them felt charged, alive with something neither had named. I am afraid, she admitted. Not of him. Of what I feel when I think of him now. Hate. It is heavy. It frightens me more than the bruises did. Silas took the final step, closing the distance. He cupped her uninjured cheek with one hand, thumb stroking once across the faint remnant of yellow. Good, he said softly. Fear keeps the blade sharp. Hate gives it purpose. She searched his face. And you? What do you feel? A pause. The fire crackled in the grate. I feel, he said at last, the same thing I felt when I saw you bleeding in the rain. Only colder now. Clearer. Elara leaned into his palm, the smallest surrender. He will try again. This letter proves it. He will try, Silas agreed. And he will learn what prey feels when the hunter becomes the hunted. Outside, clouds lowered, promising snow. Inside, the morning room seemed to contract around them, the air thick with shared resolve and older, deeper currents. Elara drew a steadying breath. I want to help end it. Not hide here while you fight alone. Silas's hand slid from her cheek to the nape of her neck, a possessive, protective hold. You will, he said, but not by placing yourself in his reach again. Langley's weapon has always been your doubt, your belief that you deserve less. We will take that weapon from him. How? By letting him see you unafraid. By letting him see me unleash everything I have held back for your sake. Elara's pulse beat hard beneath his fingers. She understood suddenly the true depth of the leash he had worn these years, the restraint that had kept his vengeance from boiling over long ago. All for her. To spare her the ugliness of what he was capable of. She covered his hand with hers. Then unleash it, she said. I am done shrinking. Something fierce and tender flared in Silas's eyes. He bent his head until their foreheads touched, a silent vow passing between them in the hush. Far away in London, Felix Langley sat in his darkening study, penning another careful letter, believing still that he held the stronger hand. He did not yet understand that the prey had found her voice, and the hunter had slipped the chain. Snow began to fall across the moor, soft and relentless, erasing tracks, muffling sound. In the fortress of Blackwood, two people stood close in the gathering white, preparing for the next move in a game that had just become mortal. The journey south took 3 days through sleeting rain and iron-hard roads. Silas traveled light, 1 coach, 4 outriders, no luggage beyond a single valise. Elara remained at Blackwood Manor under heavy guard. He had kissed her once, fiercely, on the dawn of his departure, promising return within the week. She had not asked him to stay. She had only said, "Make him feel small." London received him with the same wary hush that had settled over the city since Harrington's ruin. Carriages slowed as his passed. Men on the street touched their hats, but did not linger. Even the stray dogs seemed to slink aside. White's Club in St. James's Street was quieter than usual that evening. The great bow window overlooking the street held only a scattering of members, most clustered near the fire with newspapers folded to the financial pages. Conversation was subdued. The betting book lay closed on its lectern. When the porter announced the Duke of Blackwood, a ripple passed through the room like wind over wheat. Silas entered without removing his greatcoat. Rainwater dripped from its hem onto the ancient Turkey carpet. He paused on the threshold, gray eyes sweeping the card room, the reading room, the coffee room beyond. Heads turned, then quickly away. No one met his gaze for long. Felix Langley sat alone at a small table near the hearth, a half-empty glass of port before him. He had lost weight in the fortnight since Vauxhall. His neckcloth was carelessly tied, his waistcoat unbuttoned. The Gazette beside his elbow carried fresh notices of Carver's estates going to auction. Langley's own name had begun to appear in smaller paragraphs. Creditors growing restless, a whisper of forgery inquiries. He had come to White's seeking allies and found only averted eyes. He sensed the change in the room before he saw its cause. When he looked up, Silas was already standing over him. Langley's glass trembled in his hand. He set it down with a soft clink. "Your Grace," he managed. The words came out dry. Silas did not speak. He simply drew out the opposite chair and sat, unhurried, arranging the damp folds of his coat. The firelight caught the hard planes of his face, turning the scar along his jaw, a souvenir from Waterloo, into a thin white seam. He rested both gloved hands on the table, fingers steepled. Langley tried for a smile. It faltered. "If you've come to gloat over Harrington..." "I have not come about Harrington." The silence that followed was worse than any shout. Around them, members found sudden reasons to move to other rooms. Chairs scraped, newspapers rustled. Within moments, the coffee room held only the two of them and a white-faced steward hovering near the door. Langley swallowed. "Then perhaps we might speak privately." "We are private." Silas's voice was conversational, almost mild, yet it carried to every corner of the emptying room. The steward retreated, pulling the door closed behind him. Langley leaned forward, lowering his tone. "Whatever you believe, Blackwood, I had no part in harming the girl. A misunderstanding, perhaps." High spirits, Silas lifted one hand, a small motion. Langley stopped as though struck. "You planned it," Silas said quietly. "You chose the garden, the hour, the masks. You told Harrington where to strike so the bruises would show. You watched." Langley's mouth opened, closed. Color drained from his face. He glanced around, but rescue would not come. "This is not the place for accusations." "It is the perfect place." Silas leaned back, studying him the way a man studies an insect pinned to cork. "Every man who has turned from you tonight once called you friend. They know what you are. They simply waited for proof." Langley's fingers curled around the stem of his glass as though it were a lifeline. "You have no proof?" "I have no need of courts." Silas's tone did not alter. "Harrington is bankrupt. Carver will be by month's end. Your own notes are called in as of this morning. Your uncle has disowned you. Your mistress has taken a new protector. Even your tailor has refused credit." Each sentence landed like a separate blow. Langley's shoulders drew inward. "You cannot ruin me more than I already am," he said. But the bravado rang hollow. Silas smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I have not begun to ruin you." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. He did not unfold it. He simply laid it on the table between them. Langley stared at it as though it might bite. "That," Silas continued, "is a list of every establishment, club, theater, hell, brothel, that will refuse you entry by tomorrow. Every merchant who will not serve you, every posting house that will deny you horses. You will find London a very small city, Langley, and England smaller still. Langley's breathing had grown shallow. What do you want? Nothing you can give? Silas rose slowly. The chair legs scraped against the floor like a warning. But I will have what you owe. He stepped around the table until he stood directly behind Langley's chair. He did not touch him. He did not need to. His shadow fell across the smaller man like a shroud. You will leave England, Silas said, voice low enough that Langley had to strain to hear. Tonight. You will not write to her. You will not speak her name. You will not return while I live. If you do, I will find you. And next time I will not use ink and whispers. Langley's head bowed. His hands shook in his lap. Please, he whispered. The word came out broken. Silas leaned down until his breath stirred the hair at Langley's temple. Beg louder. Langley's voice cracked. Please, Blackwood. Mercy. The plea echoed in the empty room. Somewhere beyond the door, footsteps paused, then hurried away. Silas straightened. He looked down at the man who had once made Elara doubt her worth and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. You mistook silence for weakness, he said. Hers, mine. Remember that, on whatever patch of foreign soil you rot. He turned to leave. At the door he paused, glancing back once. The port is on your account. The door closed softly behind him. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street lamps burned steady in the wet night. Silas drew on his gloves and walked to his waiting carriage without haste. Members of White's watched from the bow window as he climbed inside, faces pale, mouths tight. By morning, every club in London would know that Felix Langley had been seen on his knees, begging the Duke of Blackwood for mercy that was not granted. And somewhere far north, in the fortress of Blackwood Manor, Elara would wake to the news and feel, for the first time, the full measure of what it meant to be cherished by a man who had never learned the meaning of forgiveness. The carriage rolled forward into the darkness. 2 names remained on Silas's list, but the worst of them was broken. The wrath of the Duke had spoken, and London listened. The summons came at dawn, sealed with the Lord Chancellor's ribbon and delivered by a liveried messenger whose horse had foundered twice on the frozen roads from London. Silas read it once in the library, firelight flickering across the heavy paper, then folded it and placed it in his pocket as though it were no more than an invitation to dine. He did not speak of it until breakfast, when Elara entered the morning room and found him standing at the window, watching snow drift across the moor. They have accused me of high treason, he said without turning. Correspondence with French agents, plots to overthrow the crown, the usual fictions. Elara's cup paused halfway to her lips. Langley? And Carver. Harrington is too broken to sign his name, but the others have found desperate courage. A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. They believe the House of Lords will move swiftly to seize my papers before I can seize theirs. She set the cup down carefully. And will they? They will try. He faced her then, expression unreadable. I must return to London tomorrow. The hearing is set for the day after. I am coming with you. Silas crossed the room in 3 strides. No, you will remain here, where it is safe. Elara lifted her chin. The bruises had faded to faint shadows, but something harder had taken their place. They will twist everything you have done into proof of guilt. Your silence, your wealth, your northern loyalties. You need a witness who can speak to why you acted. Someone they cannot dismiss as your creature. His jaw tightened. "They will tear you apart on the stand." "They have already tried," she said quietly. "I will not hide again." For a long moment he studied her, the storm in his eyes warring with reluctant pride. At last he inclined his head. "Then we ride together." They left Blackwood Manor at first light the following day, the coach flanked by a dozen mounted men in plain dark livery. The journey south was grim, roads glazed with ice, inns crowded with travelers, spreading fresh rumors of the Duke's impending arrest. In every yard, Silas was watched, weighed, whispered about. He met every stare with the same cold calm, one hand resting lightly on Elara's within the warmth of the carriage. London greeted them with a city holding its breath. Broadsheets carried lurid headlines, Blackwood to face peers on charge of treason. Crowds gathered outside his Grosvenor Square house, kept back by constables. Inside, solicitors and secretaries worked through the night, preparing defenses that Silas barely glanced at. He spent the hours before the hearing in his study with Elara, reviewing the forged letters that would be presented as evidence, elegant forgeries, he admitted, but riddled with small errors only someone intimate with his correspondence would notice. At dawn on the day of the hearing, the streets around Westminster were thick with onlookers. Carriages clogged the approaches. Vendors sold hot chestnuts and printed broadsheets to the throng. Silas and Elara descended from their coach before the great doors of the Palace of Westminster. He handed her down, his gloved fingers lingering on hers. She wore black again, severe and unadorned, a single diamond pin at her throat, the Raven of Blackwood. Her head was high, her step steady. Inside the chamber of the House of Lords, the air was heavy with candle smoke and anticipation. Peers filled the benches in somber robes, faces a gallery of curiosity and fear. The Lord Chancellor sat beneath the gilded canopy, flanked by judges in scarlet. At the bar stood Viscount Carver, gaunt and defiant. And beside him, a bandaged, trembling Harrington, propped up by sheer will. Langley was absent. Rumor said he had fled to Calais the night Silas confronted him at White's. Silas took his place with the same unhurried grace he brought to every battlefield. When the charges were read, treasonous correspondence, intent to aid Bonaparte's exiled supporters, misuse of northern levies, the chamber remained silent. No one dared even clear a throat. Carver presented the letters first, laying them on the table with a flourish. Dates, seals, signatures, all apparently impeccable. He spoke of intercepted couriers, of secret meetings in the north. His voice shook only once, when his gaze met Silas's across the chamber. Then came the witnesses. A discharged secretary claiming bribes, a French émigré swearing to coded messages. Each testimony was measured, rehearsed. The peers listened gravely, some nodding as though conviction were already certain. When the Lord Chancellor called for the defense, Silas rose. "My lords," he said, voice carrying effortlessly to the highest benches, "these letters are forgeries. I could prove it with handwriting experts, with discrepancies in seal wax, with the simple fact that no man in this chamber truly believes I would stoop to correspondence with French agents. But proof is not what this proceeding requires. Motive is." He turned then, extending one hand toward the small side door. "I call Miss Elara Beaumont." A murmur swept the chamber. Heads craned. Elara stepped forward into the pool of light beneath the great chandelier. She walked alone, spine straight, until she reached the witness bar. There she paused, meeting the sea of faces without flinching. The oath was administered. Her voice did not waver. She began with Vauxhall, the garden, the masks, the blows. She described Langley's false courtship, The years of calculated cruelty, the threats tied to her father's old debts. She spoke of the night Silas found her bleeding in the rain, of the restraint he had shown for years to shield her from worse. And then, quietly, she laid bare the reason for his vengeance. Not political ambition, not greed, but the simplest and most dangerous motive of all, love. When she described the bruises, her hand rose unconsciously to her cheek, where the last faint mark lingered. When she named the men who had orchestrated the attack, her gaze moved to Carver and Harrington. Neither could hold it. Carver interrupted twice, voice rising in denial. But each time the Lord Chancellor called for order. By the time Elara finished, silence had returned, deeper, heavier than before. Silas asked only one question. Miss Beaumont, did I ever, in your hearing or sight, speak of treason against His Majesty? No, she said clearly. You spoke only of protecting what was yours. She stepped down. Silas did not resume his seat. He walked forward, laid the forged letters side by side with genuine samples of his own hand, differences stark beneath the magnifying lens provided, and then produced the packet her father had entrusted to him years ago. The real documents, the ones Carver and Langley had feared, filled not with treason, but with their own father's signatures on illegal loans and bribes. The chamber erupted. Peers shouted for order. The Lord Chancellor's gavel pounded like gunfire. Carver lunged toward the table, face contorted, only to be restrained by sergeants at arms. Harrington simply sank into his chair, head in hands. By evening, the charges were dismissed. Carver and Harrington were taken into custody pending separate trials for perjury and conspiracy. The broadsheets that night carried new headlines. Duke of Blackwood vindicated. Miss Beaumont's testimony shatters treason plot. Silas and Elara left Westminster together, walking through the thinning crowds without haste. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, dusting the ancient stones. At the edge of the square he paused, drawing her beneath the shelter of an archway. You were magnificent, he said quietly. I was terrified, she admitted, but a small smile curved her lips. He brushed a snowflake from her lashes. You stepped into the light anyway. Elara looked up at him, the gas lamps gilding the hard lines of his face. And you let me. For the first time in public, Silas bent his head and kissed her, slowly, deliberately, as though the entire city watched and he no longer cared. When he drew back, his voice was rough with everything he had not yet said. Come home with me. She placed her hand in his. I already am. Behind them, the bells of Westminster began to ring, not for alarm, but for the simple passage of time. Ahead, the streets stretched dark and quiet. The snow erasing old footprints, the final move had been played, and the board was swept clean. Spring came late to the north, but when it arrived, it poured over Blackwood Manor like forgiveness. The snow melted in rivulets down the stone walls, the moors turned from white to vivid green, and the ancient yews shook out new needles that caught the sunlight like scattered emeralds. Inside the great house, windows long shuttered were thrown open to the warm wind, and the scent of turned earth drifted through corridors that had known only winter for too long. The news from London arrived in quiet packets, sealed with official wax and delivered by riders who no longer needed to urge their horses to breakneck speed. Viscount Carver had been stripped of title and lands. His sentence commuted to transportation on condition of permanent exile to New South Wales. Lord Harrington, broken in health and fortune, had accepted voluntary banishment to a remote estate in the Scottish Highlands, where no road connected him to polite society. Felix Langley's name appeared once more in the Gazette. Drowned, they said. when the packet boat from Calais foundered in a spring gale. No one searched long for the body. The gilded circle was no more. Its members scattered, its secrets laid bare, its power dissolved like mist in morning light. London moved on to fresh scandals, and the name of the Duke of Blackwood was spoken now with the wary respect reserved for forces of nature, storms, tides, winter itself. Silas returned to the manor on a morning when the sky was the color of pearl and the air carried the first promise of summer. He had been gone a fortnight, tying the last threads in Westminster, ensuring no appeal could resurrect the charges, no hidden ally could rise in revenge. When his horse clattered into the courtyard, Elara was waiting on the terrace steps. She wore a simple gown of pale primrose, the color of new leaves, and her hair was unbound, stirring in the breeze like dark silk. He dismounted slowly, as though the sight of her steadied something inside him that had been restless for days. Dust and road weariness clung to his coat, but his eyes sought only her. She came down the steps to meet him halfway. No words yet, just the quiet press of her hand into his, the way she rose on her toes to touch her forehead to his. He smelled of horse and leather and open air. She smelled of roses from the garden she had begun tending herself. That evening, after baths and fresh clothes and a supper neither of them tasted fully, Silas led her out onto the wide balcony that overlooked the western moor. The sun was setting in a blaze of rose and gold, painting the hills until they seemed to burn. Below them, the gardens were coming alive again, box hedges clipped, borders planted with lavender and foxglove, a new rose arbor already heavy with bud. They stood in silence for a long while, shoulder to shoulder, watching the light fade. When the first stars pricked the deepening sky, Silas turned to her. "I have something to say," he murmured. Elara looked up, a small smile curving her mouth. "You have said a great many things these past weeks, Silas Thorne. Most of them terrifying. This is different." He took her hands in his, then, slowly, deliberately, sank to one knee on the ancient stone. The movement was fluid, unforced, the posture of a soldier swearing fealty rather than a man diminished. His head remained high, gray eyes level with hers. Elara's breath caught. She had imagined this moment in fleeting, guilty dreams, but never like this, never with such quiet gravity. "Elara Beaumont," he began, voice low and steady. "I have spent years building walls, around my lands, my name, my heart. I told myself they were for protection. In truth, they were prisons. You walked into my life carrying nothing but old shame and quiet courage, and you undid every lock I had set." He turned her hands palm up, tracing the faint white lines where Vauxhall's thorns had scratched her weeks ago, healing now, but never quite gone. "I do not kneel out of pity," he continued. "I kneel because I am yours, utterly, irrevocably. I have ruined men for daring to touch you. I have burned bridges and blackened names and stood accused of treason, all without a moment's regret. But none of it matters if you do not know this truth. You are the only kingdom I wish to serve." The wind lifted her hair across her cheek. He brushed it back with reverence. "I will never again ask you to shrink, to hide, to accept less than you deserve. The world has learned what it costs to harm you. It will not dare again, not while I draw breath. But I want more than your safety, Elara. I want your days filled with light, your nights filled with peace, your life filled with the love you were always worthy of, even when you could not believe it." He reached into his coat and drew out a ring, black gold set with a single flawless diamond that caught the last ray of sun and threw it back like captured starlight. The raven crest was engraved inside the band, subtle and fierce. "Marry me," he said. "Not because I saved you, or because you need my protection. Marry me because I cannot imagine another dawn without you beside me. Because you have made a man out of a monster. Because I love you with every part of me that is not already yours." Tears slipped down Elara's cheeks, but she was smiling, radiant, unafraid. She sank to her knees before him, so they were eye to eye, her hands framing his face. "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times yes. I love you, Silas. Not the Duke, not the legend. You, the man who carried me out of the rain, the man who knelt tonight." She kissed him then, soft at first, then deeper, the taste of salt and joy mingling between them. When they drew apart, foreheads still touching, the sky had gone indigo, and the first bats flitted above the gardens. Silas slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had waited years for this moment. He rose, drawing her up with him, and wrapped her in his arms so tightly she could feel the steady thunder of his heart. Below them, the moor stretched endless and free. Ahead, the house glowed with new light in every window. Somewhere inside, servants who had served generations of silent, solitary dukes were smiling at one another, sensing the change. A new dawn had come, not just for the land, but for the people who walked it. And in the quiet darkness of the balcony, wrapped in the arms of the man who had once been called the Butcher of the North, Elara Beaumont felt, for the first time in her life, utterly and fiercely cherished. The world would never dare touch her again. But more importantly, she no longer feared it if it tried. My beautiful family. If you watched all the way through and didn't like, share, and subscribe yet, that hurts a bit. It costs nothing, but means everything to me. Without new subs, YouTube stops recommending my videos, and all this passion goes to waste. Subscribe and turn on notifications so I know I'm not creating alone. Like and share this video. Someone out there needs to see them. And tell me in the comments section, what was your favorite part of the story? At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.